Shalom, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture on comics, where we will be talking about one more superhero storyline, and then we will explore some other kinds of comics. Let's jump right in with the storyline from The Amazing Spider-Man that is now known as The Night Gwen Stacy Died, which is one of the most important comic storylines for superhero comics. Few background things to know before we talk about the story itself. I'm throwing you, as you'll note, in issue 121 and 122, well into this series where a lot of stuff has happened, especially since the first appearance of Spider-Man that I gave you last time. Peter is no longer a teenager at this point. He's a college student. I think he's a junior at this point. So that's different. Another thing is that he and Gwen Stacy have been dating for a very long time at this point. They meet as freshmen, and it takes them a while to kind of spark the romance, but eventually they do, and they are in a committed relationship. This relationship is built on some similar interests that they have. Gwen is a science major, just like Peter is, so they have that in common. Their intellectual capacities are basically the same. She's as smart as he is. They connect over the intellectual stuff, but they also connect through joint tragedy. They can understand each other. Gwen's mother died when she was very young. She experienced loss of a parent from young age. Peter lost both of his parents as a child and was raised by his aunt and uncle, and then had his uncle die when he was in high school. So they can relate to each other in terms of the losses that they've suffered. Also, up to this point, they have walked with each other through a major loss. Gwen's father was the captain of the police and an ally of Spider-Man, and he died in the line of duty during a fight with Dr. Octopus earlier in the series, and they together, Peter and Gwen, had to work through the loss of her father. So they have all these things that drive them together. But there's a big issue. Gwen does not know that Peter is Spider-Man. He has kept that secret even from her. And that was really important in these early comics. It's different in other versions of the story and TV shows and movies that are out there where Gwen does actually know who he is. But in these original comics, she didn't. And the reason Peter kept this secret from everybody in his life, no one knew that he was Spider-Man among his friends or family. And the reason for this was that he really believed that if they knew, they would be in danger. And he loved them so much that he wanted to keep them out of the reach of evil people who would want to harm Spider-Man, all of his different villains at this point. And so that's why he very harshly never lets anyone know who he is. And this creates a rather tragic aspect to his character in these early comics, that he knows Gwen and his best friend Harry Osborn and his Aunt May. He knows these people very well, but nobody really knows him, because he keeps this Spider-Man aspect of his life a complete secret. One other thing to note about Gwen Stacy is that she is very good friends, maybe even best friends, with Mary Jane Watson, also called MJ. She was a character that was also introduced later in the series. She was a fan favorite character because she's funny, very, very, very witty. And she's also beautiful. She is a model from a pretty young age in these stories. And she was always the life of the party in every social situation she was in. She didn't take anything seriously, and she always had jokes and things to do to keep anyone from getting too serious around her. This was a very big contrast to Peter's personality that tended towards manic depression at times, and fans really liked her as a character. She was also representing some different social norms. For instance, she refused to have a serious one-on-one relationship with anybody in terms of romantically. She was not going to be tied down to any one man because commitment was serious and she was not. And so she was flaunting some of the social norms at the time. Another person to understand is the villain, Norman Osborn. He is a foil for Peter in many, many ways. He is an older man, middle-aged, whereas Peter is young. That is a common trend you see in pretty much all of Spider-Man's villains from the early days. All of them were middle-aged or old adults, whereas Peter was either a teenager or a young college student. This was a part of the general theme of Peter being a teenager and of the value of young people and their struggle against the older generation. It was embodied in the ages of Peter and his villains. And this is true of Norman Osborn as well. Another important thing is Osborn is a scientist and a very wealthy businessman. He used science to advance his own wealth and power in society quite a bit. Peter is also very into science, but he's a broke college student. So they come from opposite social and economic positions. There's also the theme of power. They both have superhuman abilities. Osborn granted himself those powers, whereas Peter got his from a random accident. And Osborn uses power for himself to further his own power and influence, whereas Peter started out that way, but now uses his powers for the good of others. Their personas also are different. Osborn is the Green Goblin, and that persona is crazy. The Goblin acts crazy, laughs maniacally, is obviously a psychopath. Whereas Peter also has a persona in Spider-Man, but he's a smart aleck. So both of them are funny, but Peter is funny because of the witty smart aleckness of Spider-Man, whereas Goblin is funny because he's crazy bonkers. And though all of the villains usually are annoyed by Spider-Man's mouth, his smart aleckiness, Osborn is perhaps more annoyed than any of them, perhaps because of the clashing of their personalities and their personas there. Finally, what makes Osborn more dangerous than many of Spider-Man's other villains is that he is connected to Peter's personal life and that he is the father of Peter's best friend, Harry Osborn, and also because he is the only villain at this time who knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He's the only one who figured it out. But through convenience plot reasons, he had gotten a blunt trauma injury to his head that made him forget that he was the Green Goblin and forget that Peter was Spider-Man. But you see in this story that the psychological strain of Harry being sick and also business concerns triggers something in his psyche that makes him remember. Harry is Peter's best friend, but Harry has had not a great life. His father is frankly a bad father, as you could probably imagine, and one of the ways that he is bad is that he's always belittling Harry and bullying him as a means to try to force him to do better, to achieve more in his life. Doesn't work, and Harry eventually turns to drugs to try to deal with his psychological issues, which does not work out well and eventually leads him into this painful withdrawal that he's going through at the beginning of this series. Or the storyline, rather. That being said, one note about behind the scenes. The creative team had changed by this point. Stan Lee was no longer writing the Spider-Man stories at this point in time. A new creative team had been brought in, and that creative team really wanted to kill off Gwen Stacy because they thought she was boring. They thought she was just a typical love interest character, but they really liked Mary Jane, and they wanted Peter to get with her. So their solution to this was to kill off Gwen Stacy so that Peter could eventually get with Mary Jane. Fans strongly disliked this storyline, and they were very vocal about it. They got tons of hate mail for this action. Though these creators were obviously not interested in Gwen anymore, thought she was boring, the fans ferociously disagreed. They thought that Gwen was an important character, and they were shocked and in some cases enraged that they killed her off in the way they did. Stan Lee himself was also pretty ticked off. They made this decision while he was out of the country, and when he came back, it'd been done, and there was nothing he could do about it. And he was pretty ticked off about that for the rest of his life. He never really liked talking about the death of Gwen Stacy because he had always intended for Peter to wind up getting married to her. That was his plan originally when he created the characters. Her death begins what's called the Bronze Age of comics. And in this new age, coming out of the Silver Age, in the Bronze Age, comic book writers realized because of this storyline that they could address stories that deal with real loss and real violence and real tragedy, which they didn't really realize didn't feel safe doing before. Yes, you had main characters die before, but those were characters like Uncle Ben, for instance, who dies completely off panel, or people like Captain Stacy, who was a police officer and he died in the line of duty. But to have someone who was completely innocent, who wasn't involved, who was out cold and couldn't do anything to fight back, to be just senselessly murdered just because she happened to be the boyfriend of Spider-Man, something she didn't even know herself, right? This reflected senseless tragedies that struck much closer to things that happen in the real world that are not comfortable to be addressed. And this made comic book writers realize they could do that sort of thing. And then they really ran with it. People in DC and everywhere else started to do stuff like this to kill beloved characters, to but to portray in the comic art, these tragedies. At the same time, we need to note that this starting off of the Bronze Age all happens because of violence done to a woman by a man. And this is sadly a precedent that becomes set in superhero comics of the violent death of a woman, usually a love interest, triggering the male character to have a transformation or to become more resolute in fighting the villain and all of that kind of stuff. In the comic, Gwen's death primarily is tragic because of what it does to Peter, not because of the tragedy itself necessarily. And this is a common trope in superhero comics. Today it's usually called the women in refrigerator trope or fridging. And that actually comes from a much later comic where the Green Lantern discovered his girlfriend's body inside of a refrigerator. And her death spurs him on to become the full hero he needs to be and defeat the bad guy. And a lot of readers, especially women, find this trope very frankly sexist because it treats women as pawns in games between a male superhero and a male villain. And the death is primarily a tool the writers use to bring about a character transformation rather than it just being a tragedy in and of itself that a person has been killed. That being said, Gwen's death, let's talk about it a little bit in detail. It is particularly tragic because there's ambiguity of who exactly killed Gwen Stacy. The Goblin throws her off the bridge. However, Spider-Man's means of trying to rescue her is what actually kills her. When he spins that web down and catches her by the legs, the momentum causes her neck to snap, and that's what kills her. If he had wanted to save her and had been thinking things through, what he should have done was swung down and caught her himself and then swung back up, and that would have kept that force from snapping her neck, but he wasn't thinking straight at the time. So, who really killed Gwen? Was it Osborn or was it Peter? Peter, for the rest of his life, in every storyline where this story is part of the canon, blames himself for her death, feels that he was responsible because if he had just done things differently, she would have lived. And so he bears guilt for killing the love of his life. I think that Goblin was the one who pushed her off, and she was going to die no matter what unless Spider-Man did something. So Goblin is the one who really bears the guilt for it. But it's part of Peter's character that he tends to blame himself, even when he shouldn't. And so that could also be part of the reason for Peter's pretty dramatic character change in the second half of the storyline. He is out to murder Osborn for revenge, which is not something Peter has ever done before. In these comics, he had thus far held to the Batman kind of ethics of it is never good to kill anyone, no matter how bad or evil they are. However, none of his other villains have shown themselves to be as evil, as sadistic, there we go, as the Goblin is. And none of them have harmed Peter himself as much as he has. So this drives him to vengeance and rage. There might be another psychological aspect of it, though. As I said, Peter does have some internalized guilt over what happened to Gwen. And if you have rage at yourself, there's only two things you can really do with rage at yourself. You can either kill yourself, which is never a good option, not good, and most people recognize that and so don't do it, or do the really hard psychological work of coming to terms with your guilt and seeking forgiveness or reconciliation or peace of some kind that usually comes through years of psychological work. Both of those options are very difficult, so a lot of people will choose another option, which is project that rage onto another person and blame that person for everything, which could be part of what's going on here for Peter. Like I said, I think Osborn really does bear most of the guilt for this, but Peter could be drawing on his own self-hatred and his hatred for the Goblin. This pain also leads Peter to do one of the worst things he ever does. That scene that happens when he goes to the Osborn house and Harry is begging him not to leave him alone with all of his psychological and physical torment from the withdrawals. And Peter just shuts the door and leaves, or at least walks out the door. He abandons his best friend at the moment when he needed him most. And that is one of the least heroic things I can possibly think of. And what it shows you is how damaged Peter has become by the death of Gwen, that he no longer even cares about the people around him. All he cares about is killing the Goblin. Then we have the final battle between Spider-Man and the Goblin. Goblin doesn't do himself any favors because he has a little hissy fit over Peter destroying his glider that shows Peter that he doesn't care about people, he cares about objects more than people. And then when he starts to say that Gwen was just a woman like millions of others, that just sends Peter off the edge into his murderous rage. And he totally pummels Osborn. And he's this close to beating him to death. But then he stops and he remembers who he is. And he knows that he can't do this. He can't murder another person. Even if that person deserves it, he can't bring himself to do that. And that is Spider-Man's most heroic moment, I think, in the story, when he knows that he can't and he chooses not to. Ironically, though, he doesn't have to, because the Goblin winds up killing himself. And through trying to kill Spider-Man in that last-ditch effort with the glider being remote control, he winds up getting impaled himself. And this is a very important theme, not just in this comic, but in lots of literature, that evil is ultimately self-destructive. To paraphrase something from the book of Proverbs, a man who digs a hole will fall into it. The goblin was an evil man who killed other people, and through his own actions, he dies. So, the cosmic justice of that. But, tragically, the goblin's death doesn't make Peter feel any better. It doesn't take the pain away like he thought he would, like he thought it would. This is another very important lesson. Vengeance does not solve anything. It does not take away the pain of that loss. And anybody who's had a family member or a loved one actually murdered can tell you this. Seeing that person punished, a lot of times they had this idea in their mind that seeing that person caught and punished would make them feel better. It doesn't. It doesn't. Then we have the ending, which I think is very powerful because of MJ's character. When Peter is at his apartment and she's there waiting for him, and she is also hurting because Gwen was her friend, and Peter just berates her. He unleashes all of his anger onto her because the goblin didn't work as someone to project anger on, so he takes it out on Mary Jane. Talks about how she never takes anything seriously and tells her to just get out. And then she starts to go out, but she hears him sobbing behind her. And now she has a decision to make. Is she going to continue to be the person she has been up till this point, someone who doesn't take anything seriously, someone who always pulls away from anyone or anything that starts to get too emotional, too serious? Or is she going to go help her friend who is suffering? And she chooses to help him. And that, I think, is the most heroic action in this whole story. Not done by a superhero, but by a normal, everyday person, which once again affirms the power of ordinary people. Let's move on to a completely different type of comic, the Peanuts comics, which were created by Charles Schulz and is the single longest running comic book newspaper strip in existence. There are literally thousands of Peanuts comics, all done by a single man, Charles Schulz. But not only did he do that, he also storyboarded all of the cartoons that we remember. A Charlie Brown Christmas, It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown, the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, on and on and on. He created all of those stories too. So, what do we see in these comics? We see a lot of complexity, actually. The humor in these comics is quite sophisticated. On a basic level, it comes from the novelty of these kids grappling with issues that are too old for them to be grappling with. Things like existentialism, things like the true meaning of Christmas as in the gospel, right? Things like unrequited love between Lucy and Schroeder. That is funny, but it's also serious at the same time because he seriously explores many of these issues through these characters. There is, on a technical level, an interesting thing that you'll see where a lot of comics have this kind of, for lack of a better word, cycle effect or a framing effect where there will be one panel at the beginning, panels in between, and then the last panel will be the exact same panel as the first panel, but with new dialogue to show that we've returned to the beginning, but now something is different. You see that very clearly in one of the comics I gave you, which was part of Snoopy writing his autobiography. Right here you can see This frame and this frame are exactly the same. But what's been different in the middle, what's changed, is the appearance of Lucy and how she has influenced his writing. What ultimately is going on with these characters? Well, like I said, melancholy humor. And the characters often get the opposite of what they want, and they get rejected frequently. Charlie Brown rejected by his friends. Lucy rejected by Schroeder. Snoopy rejected by publishers. And it reflects a real part of a lot of our lives, that we all deal with rejection, we deal with loss, we deal with negative things happening to us. And this story shows us that, these stories rather, of these Peanuts characters, show us that we're not alone and gives us a guide, hope of how to move forward through those situations. 3 examples. Charlie Brown. Oh, poor Charlie Brown. He always gets the worst of it. And sadly, not many characters change to help him. The one comic where he's talking to Lucy and she's wanting to be a better listener, but she's not. She's not listening to him. Or Peppermint Patty when she's saying she needs to be with somebody who's been completely humiliated and ruined, and then Charlie Brown's like, that's what I am. Poor Charlie Brown. So how does he move on from these issues? Ultimately through the support of his friends, people like Linus, people like Snoopy, who help him to move forward even though the circumstances of his life might not change. They enable him to have a more positive outlook. You also see poor Snoopy getting his manuscript rejected. Ah, the plight of all us writers, the rejection letter. But his was particularly cruel, right? Where they were like, dear contributor, we received your manuscript. Why did you send it to us? As in, it's so bad. Why did you inflict this story upon us? And that's life. But it makes us writers feel better about ourselves, right? Because, well, Snoopy got rejected, so, part of life, part of life. And of course, Lucy and Schroeder. Lucy being continually rejected by Schroeder, and Schroeder sadly not being understood by Lucy with his whole art. It's not about money. All of that. And these characters, we relate to them because even though they're children, they deal with things that adults deal with on a daily basis. But they, in the comic format, Schultz boils it down to its basic components, as in the basic components of the life we deal with in contemporary America, and offers us empathy, that he knows what it's like. And he shows ourselves back at us through these characters, which is quite genius and quite sophisticated for a comic strip. There's also political / social commentary going on. You see this on the political side with Snoopy and Woodstock, right? Where Snoopy is holding up a picket sign with a question mark, and Snoopy is like, he's a good guy, but I don't know where he stands. That is commentary on politics, 100%. The issue of politicians who make a big fuss about things, or even perhaps social justice warriors who are protesting things, and they're loud, but are they actually saying anything that makes sense? Are they vocalizing a position that you can figure out what it is they're actually wanting to happen? Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. And Schultz observed that and makes a joke about it in that. Art is another big thing. Art. Schroeder is all about art. He doesn't care about money. He wants art, which is, once again, always an issue for artists. Artists want to make art, but they also want to eat. And there's the tension between them that Schultz knew very well, being an artist himself. And finally, my third example of this is Linus and the Leaf, right? No one's ever content where they are. Linus sighs as he sees a leaf falling down, which is funny, but also accurate about some types of people. That, like leaves, they're never satisfied. They'd rather fall to the ground just to get a change. And Schultz was an observer of that. He was a very good observer of people. Ultimately, though, as you can see, this is a lot of different stuff that goes into these different cartoons / comic strips at different times. But what is it that the strip is overall trying to do? I think that overall, Schultz is trying to get us to sympathize, if not empathize, with ordinary people and with children, the groups that don't get a lot of spotlight in fiction. People don't tend to write comic books about ordinary people. They write them about superheroes and stuff like that. But Schultz wants us to pay attention to ordinary people with no special powers, no adventures, no crazy radioactive insanity that happens. Just children dealing with the complexities of being human. And perhaps wants us to see that that matters, that those children have value, that they need to be cared about. And their stories are worth showing just as much as the stories of superheroes. Finally, I gave you an example of a Japanese comic called a manga. One very interesting thing that unfortunately you guys didn't get to experience because you had the YouTube video of it is these books are printed backwards from the Western perspective. If you try to hold a manga like a Western book, this is what you'll see, the back cover. And if you open it up, you will have a page that explains to you that you're reading the book the wrong way. Because how the Japanese language works, you read from right to left as opposed to left to right. So the entire comic is reversed. But you guys didn't have to go through that confusion because of the dub. Whew! What to say about Oran High School Host Club? Well, what I will say is that your two main themes here are privilege, the privilege of the rich, and also gender are the two main issues at the forefront in this comic, which is a comedy, so it is meant to be over the top and crazy and not taken seriously in the way that other comic book stories would be. Oran High School is rich, privileged, and completely disconnected from the realities of Haru's normal world, right? And one of the reasons that all the boys can be so over the top in the host club is because they come from a world where there are no consequences for them. They don't have to act a certain way because they're a bunch of rich kids. They can do what they want. Haru, on the other hand, faces major consequences for an accident, right? She accidentally breaks the vase, and now she's got to work her butt off to pay that debt to this host club. And so from the beginning, you see an extreme dichotomy between Haru and the rest of the characters. You also see that the villain in this story is a spoiled classist jerk, right? She's someone who doesn't like Haru because Haru is not rich and privileged like they are. And she constantly belittles her and calls her down and tries to do horrible bullying stuff to them. At the same time, there is some complexity because even though the hosts are privileged teenage guys who don't have to deal with a lot of consequences for their actions, they are very competent in running their business, even though they don't seem like it at first. And they are very good at policing the club, as the ending showed, where they know that the villain had done wrong and they ban her from the host club. So they're not jerks in the same way that she is. And that makes them better people than her, for instance, and some of the other characters you might meet throughout the rest of the series. And so there is this tension going on there of there are rich, privileged people who don't bear a lot of consequences for their actions, but they can choose to be either jerks or good people. They can either be like the girl, think the commoners are just beneath them and not want to have anything to do with them, or like the teenage boys, they can see Haru as a trailblazer with the fact that she got into the school because of her academic achievements. And they're also fascinated with her life, what the life of the commoners is like. Commoners coffee, commoners ramen. They're all very interested in these things. So there's that dichotomy. So it's not ultimately anti-rich people. It's anti-rich people who are jerks and don't care about the people who aren't as privileged as they are. That's a fairly simple one, but it's also interesting that we see that theme in comics not infrequently, like the original Batman story, for instance. Then there's the things about gender in this story. They all assume Haru is a guy, right, because of her clothing. Because at the beginning, she's dressed in something that they would expect guys to wear. So they assume that she is a guy. What this is critiquing is the idea of gendered clothing, basically. Does clothing actually make you male or female? This comic says no. You should never assume anyone's gender just based on their clothing, which goes against what most people in Japanese and Western society would think, because they tend to code their clothing very strictly of what is masculine and what is feminine. But those things aren't real. They are social conventions, and they change over time or based on culture. Classic example, there are African tribes where men wear dresses and makeup, and they are considered extremely masculine for doing so. Gender is not in clothing, and that's one of the things that this comic is trying to bring about. What's also interesting, though, is that it's deeper than that for this comic. The things that society in general, both Japanese society and a lot of these things American society also has, characteristics that they assign to each gender in terms of personality, this comic also attacks the legitimacy of those things. For instance, take Tamaki, for example. Tamaki is obsessed with his appearance. He is extremely vain, and he is always concerned with looking his best. He is also extremely sensitive, right? When Haru calls him annoying, he goes off in the corner and he cries. And he does that multiple times in this series, right? Both of these things are traits usually associated with girls and femininity, that they are obsessed with their appearance and they're also very emotional and sensitive. And yet here is Tamaki, a guy, displaying those characteristics. You see similar things with Honey, for instance, who is obsessed with his teddy bear, right? This is not something that's usually expected from guys, because in Japanese society, guys are expected to grow up and not hold on to childish things like teddy bears. But girls were considered to be okay for them to hold on to things from their childhood. Yet here is Honey, who is actually one of the oldest members of the host club, holding on to his teddy bear. Once again, here is a guy displaying qualities that society would usually consider to be feminine. They also are all having tea parties, right? But the guys are hosting the tea parties. This is another thing. Guys in Japan and in America do not tend to be expected to be into tea and tea parties, something I find very sexist, by the way, because I do enjoy a good tea party and tea. At the same time that that's going on, Tamaki is extremely disturbed when he realizes that Haru is actually a girl, right? But she doesn't think that there are differences between the genders, as in these personality social differences that she talks about. And that's where the first episode of the manga leaves us, with Tamaki being shocked, his mind being totally blown, that this person who displays all these stereotypical masculine qualities, right? Not being emotional, being blunt, being serious about her studies, right? Rather than frivolous stuff. Those were masculine qualities, and yet Haru has all of them. We have to be careful, though, whenever we're reading literature from another culture, as I've told you guys before, we cannot assume that our values are the same exact thing as the values that the text is giving. This text, for instance, is not denying that gender exists as a biological concept, which is something that in the West, especially in America, folks are more apt to do, right, with LGBTQ plus ideologies or worldviews saying that gender is a social construct, things like that. They would say that gender just doesn't exist in some cases. That's not what Haru is saying. She's saying that the perceptions of what gender is, as in clothing, as in these personality traits, as in anything that does not relate to the actual biology of the hardware that people has, she considers those things to be social constructs, to not be the same. So it doesn't mean that she doesn't think she's a girl. She says clearly that she never claimed to be anything other than a girl. It's just that she is going to be who she is as a girl, regardless of whether those qualities that she has, the culture around her would consider to be feminine or not. She is going to be a girl that acts to the culture like a guy, and she's going to say, tough. Doesn't matter that people don't think girls can be like this. She's going to be like that. And the fact that the manga is also undercutting the traditional expectations of men with many of the host characters is showing that overall the text considers not that gender is a social construct, but the non-biological aspects of gender. So what I mean by that is these personality traits that we've seen before: vanity, emotional fragility, seriousness about studies. All of these things have nothing to do with biology. They can exist in a man or a woman. Tough, deal with it. Whether or not society realizes that that's true, it is true, this comic is telling us, and therefore people need to stop making assumptions about people based on their gender. This text, from, if nothing else, this text tells you that you know nothing about a person just by looking at them. You cannot know their gender. You cannot know anything about anyone except if you take the time to know that person through a relationship. That is the only way that you can know anything about that person, which is what happens with Tamaki and the rest of them in the course of this comic, getting to know Haru as a person. Well, that's all I have for this week. I hope you have enjoyed this dive into comics, and I will see you next time. God bless you.